Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person since it began at the museum in 2000. Each month, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival of the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Holocaust survivors are Jews who experienced the persecution and survived the mass murder that was carried out by the Nazis and their collaborators. This included those who were in concentration camps, killing centers, ghettos, and prisons, as well as refugees or those in hiding. Holocaust survivors also include people who did not self-identify as Jewish, but were categorized as such by the perpetrators. During our program, please send us your questions and let us know where you are watching from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Manny Mandel share his first-person account of the Holocaust with us today. Manny, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person.
Hi, Bill. It's very nice to be here, and thank you for the introduction.
Manny, you have so much to share with us in a short period, so we'll jump right in. You were born in Riga, Latvia in 1936. Before we turn to the war years, please introduce us to your parents, and let's start with your mother, Ella.
My mother was born and then raised in what was southern Hungary, and then after the First World War became Yugoslavia with the Trianon treaties, change of landlines. She was trained to be a school teacher, an elementary school teacher, which she did for several years before she and my father married in 1930.
And Manny, this photo obviously soon after your birth.
I'm only a few weeks old because, as we'll get into a little bit later, we did not stay in Riga very long after my birthday. We're just staying there long enough for me to arrive, and I must be several weeks old here before we then left, and we'll get to that a little bit later, to Hungary.
And your father, Yehuda, was born into an observant Jewish family. Tell us about him.
My father was born in what was then known as Transylvania. Today it's in the Ukraine. It's interesting for me to always remember that he was born in what was then Austro-Hungary. It then became Czechoslovakia. Today it's the Ukraine. The community didn't move, but the ruling parties, the various authorities did. As a consequence, the place changed from country to country.
Did your father have a large family?
My father was one of 7 children. I would imagine there may have been more than 7. My grandmother may have had as many as 10, but 7 became adults.
And tell us, how did your parents meet?
My father, all of his life, was a cantor. The cantor is the man in the synagogue who chants, who sings the prayers. And these people were, in some places, major stars of their own. Mm-hmm. My father's hope in life was to be one of the chief cantors in the city of Budapest, which was probably one of the 10 most important positions in all of Europe. He trained in Vienna, and although he was offered a very prestigious position in Vienna upon graduation, he chose to stay in Hungary, Vienna being in Austria, and he moved to the city of Novi Sad, which was then Hungary, Yugoslavia, and there he met my mother. He came there in 1927, I think, and maybe 28, I don't know exactly, and they were married in 1930. They then chose to leave Novi Sad in 1933, 34, and he took a position again of some significance in the city of Riga, where I was born. They then waited. He was looking to go to Budapest, where they couldn't get working papers. This is the beginning of sorts of the antisemitic kind of moves. He was unable to get papers because he had been an Austrian-born Czech citizen. He became a Czech citizen because he was conscripted into the Czech army, where he served for a year and a half, so whatever the requirements were. But as I say, we went to Riga. I was born there. We got papers in 1936 to be able to get employment in Budapest, which was his dream of his life, which he did. We went to Budapest.
And tell us a little more about the new job as cantor he got, because as you said, it was the dream of his life, because it was a really big deal.
Well, I mean, this may sound a little bit, overdone, but if there's a Metropolitan Opera of the Cantorate, There were several of these in Europe, and Hungary was one of them. Berlin was another, Moscow was another, Vienna was another. And he was able to achieve what had been his lifelong dream, lifelong. He was only 32 years old at the time, to be a chief cantor in the city of Budapest with a choir of 40 male voices, and he had a lifetime position. Lifetime until the man with the little mustache messed that up.
We have a photograph. Tell us about this photograph, Manny. Yep.
This is in Budapest, and this is at the banks of the Danube River, where we would walk out to just be outside. And I don't know the name or who that youngster was who's with me, but it's based on his size and his looks. It must be one of my friends, one of my classmates. And they cleared the streets with the snow and piled it up on the banks there. And I decided to move all of that snow with my large shovel and my large pail.
You're doing a really good job of it. We can see that. Absolutely. Manny, before we go on, I'd like to let you know that we have people watching and listening to you today from not only across the country, but other places in the world. We have people from New York, Iowa, Minnesota, and Texas. And we have international viewers today in Nicaragua, New Zealand, Canada, and Malta. I'd also like to share an audience comment that's already come in from a viewer named Lily. Lily wrote, I worked with Manny this summer during the museum's Stephen Tyrone John Summer Youth Leadership Program. Such an amazing person.
Thank you.
Manny, World War II, of course, began September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. In 1940, Hungary formally allied with Nazi Germany, and then in 1941 joined in the German-led invasions of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Please tell us what you remember about the bombing raids early in the war.
Well, Budapest, where we lived in an apartment building, 5 stories, we were on the top floor. The bombing was not too significant. As a matter of fact, the alerts, the various raids were more frequent than the actual bombing. We were told to go down to the basement, which was the shelter, once, twice, sometimes 3 times at night. Now, some of those trips to the basement also but also where the bombings took place. But it's important to note that Budapest was not severely hurt, much as Warsaw and other kind of cities. It was bombed, but it was bombing light. However, very dangerous. And for me as a child, my recollection had to do with that being the war. This is before Holocaust issues. And after all, if a bomb fell in the building next door to us and did some damage, it could have in some way hurt or killed a couple of the kids who lived there with whom I may have gone to school. So the frightening part was the noise and the result of craters and whatnot created by bombs and some destruction of buildings. That was my first recall and connection with the war.
And as you said, although the difficulties that you experienced and saw early on were related more to the war, like the bombing, the Hungarian regime was anti-Semitic and actively discriminated against Jews. And there were a few anti-Semitic laws passed that impacted life in your household. Please tell us what happened to the maid that your family employed.
Well, the Hungarian numerous clauses, which were the various kinds of restrictive laws about who could work where and how many could work wherever, were passed in the Hungarian legislature in the 20s. They were not put into effect until the late 30s, which is after the ones that came out of Nuremberg. Certain rules came up and said that at some point, the middle-class families, most of whom employed some kind of domestic help, we had a maid in the house who had her own quarters, her own bedroom, and was my buddy because she was about 17 and I was 7 or 6. And in a sense, it was the closest to my age, and she was a farm girl, and we had a chance to at least play some games together. But she was told she had to leave. Why? Because Jews could not employ household help. Now, she wanted to take me with her back to her farm village, not far from Budapest. My parents did not like the idea. She thought that I would be safer there. And she probably would have been right, but my parents would not agree, and I'm glad that they didn't. Other kinds of things began to happen. Most of these were minor in one sense. However, as time went on, they became more important. For example, man comes to the door one given day and says to whoever opened the door, it wasn't me, I came here to take your telephone. So the question was asked. Now, my father used a telephone, not extensively. I'm not sure I ever used it. It's not like today. But the point is, he had to take the phone because the law said Jews may not have telephones. Now, the logic of that doesn't exist, but those are the kinds of things they did. Later on, there were other things that happened that had to do with the Nazi government's, the Hungarian Nazi government's rules.
And in fact, although early in the war, most Hungarian Jews were initially spared deportation until the German occupation began in 1944, but that did not mean that all Jews had been safe under Hungarian rule. In January 1942, while you were visiting relatives, you had a horrifying experience. Tell us what you remember about what happened.
Well, as you said, Bill, the rules of life did not become severe until a little later on during the war. So 1941 in December, actually, my mother and my father and I decided to take a trip south to my mother's hometown. We could go there by train, about 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours by train, and spend a week or so with my grandparents, my two aunts, my mother's sisters, and my cousin, the daughter of one of her sisters, a year younger than I. We got there. We were there for a day or two. I don't remember exactly how many. And somebody was coming up the stairs or the elevator and said, "There's something funky going on the street." Within minutes of that time, knock on the door, two uniformed policemen come and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you need to dress warmly. You need to come outside." Now, please understand, this is December. It's cold. It's not bitter. It's not blizzardy. There's no 7 feet of snow, but there's some snow on the ground, and it is winter. So we got dressed up in warm clothes and boots and whatever, and went outside. We were told to stand on the sidewalk and then eventually, after a few minutes, to turn left and start walking in that direction, which we did. Now, we walked for several hours, as I recall, and I can tell you, I'm 5.5 years old. I'm a little guy. My mother carried me, my father carried me, and much of it I did walking myself until we arrived at a place which, interestingly, I recognized. This was the scene. There was a 7-foot stockade fence on our left, there was a sidewalk on which we were walking, and there was a major road to our right. Why did I recognize it? Well, in European cities which are not on the sea or on a lake, the folks who lived there would make beaches out of rivers. The Danube River flowed about 300 or 400 yards to our left inside this stockade fence. And I had been there previously that summer, maybe in August, when it was warm and sunny, and was able to enjoy the hot pool, the cold pool, the wave pool, restaurants, playgrounds, whatever inside. It was a lovely beach setting, which of course in the wintertime was closed down. This is December. The ice was frozen, I'm told about 3 feet thick, and the place was locked down. But for some reason, it was opened up. And as we saw ahead of us on the road, the gates, the entry gates into this place, which was part of the stockade fence, were open. And folks went to that point, turned left towards the river. We had no idea why. Later on, we found out why. As we were walking in that direction, the police officer turns to my father and says to him, "Mister, what are you doing here?" Well, my father says, "I'm visiting my family." He says, "Well, that's not my issue. This was supposed to have been a census." Understand, please, that the Nazis did censuses, if that's the word, every 15 minutes. I exaggerate. But they thought if they knew exactly where everybody is, they could control the population. And they were right. So they called this a census, which it wasn't, but he thought it was. It was brought in from Budapest. He said he is a foot patrolman in the neighborhood where we lived, and said he saw my father on the street many, many times, going to here, going there, to an office, go to a grocery store or whatever. And he recognized him and he said, "Please leave the group that you're with, and you and this little group of yours step aside." As he told us to step aside, within minutes, a staff car came down the main road, a uniformed officer came out, had a discussion with his buddies. And what he did at that point is, in fact, got on a bullhorn and said, "The requirements of the census have been met. Go home. There's a school down the block. There's hot chocolate and coffee. You can help yourself and go ahead." We didn't do that. We went right back to my aunt's apartment where we were staying, and the phone calls began to come in. My mother was the oldest of the three. Where we stayed in the apartment was the youngest of the three. The middle sister calls and says, "Where were you all day?" And we had some plans that day to get together, whatever. She said, we told her. She said, well, I didn't go there because police officers came to my door, asked me 3 questions about some census. I gave them a cup of coffee, and they left. And I've been here all day long. As the calls began to come in, we began to understand something which I couldn't understand, but at least I can remember. This was an event whereby everybody who made that left turn towards the river, towards the Danube, got to the river, which had been blown open that morning by cannon fire, so that the ice was cleared. People were shot in the back into the river and floated downriver to be found in March when the river thawed out, or to places where the river was, where the ice was a little thinner, where they could come up. This was a pogrom. This was the retaliation on the part of the government for some partisan activity that took place in the general area of Novi Sad, which is the city where we're talking about. And this was a particular experience that obviously I wasn't a victim of, but I know about, and I was present when this took place. Several hundred people were killed.
We have a film clip of your father reflecting on this harrowing experience that you all experienced. Let's hear from your father.
People were crying, and when we heard ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, another few shots, we knew what's happening. We imagined what's happening, and people were crying and hollering and throwing themselves to the floor, to the ground, and as can well be imagined what happened. But before we should have gone in and be the next ones to be killed, the killing stopped. From there, we were taken into a gymnasium, walked back, and when we spoke about where we are going and what happened, one of the policemen who was walking alongside with us told me, "You are very lucky people."
It's interesting that this video was done of my father's interview at the Holocaust Museum when he was 86 years old, which interestingly is precisely what I am today.
Yeah, that really is. Thanks for sharing that. Shortly after this experience, Manny, you would see your father far less often. The Hungarian government established a discriminatory forced labor service for Jewish men, and your father was conscripted into a forced labor battalion in 1942. Please tell us more about these battalions and share what it meant for you and your family, and also tell us a little bit about this photo.
Well, this photo is in a public parkway between our house and one of the markets where we used to go. My father used to go there occasionally to buy certain things, although the major shopping was not done by him. And I'm here maybe 5 years old or thereabouts, and somebody took the picture, I don't know who. We have several pictures of this particular excursion. I always ask them to buy some fresh green peas, and I would eat them on the way home. So by the time we got home, half of the peas that he bought, whatever, a pound or so, were gone. But this is just a recollection I have of my father and I. In 1942, I'm 6 years old, the rules were activated whereby the Hungarian male population was in the army, and they were fighting actually on the Russian front. So what the Hungarians, Nazis and no-Nazis, in fact, established was a labor battalion calling Hungarian Jewish men into these battalions. They could not be eligible for the military, to do certain kind of work that had to be done by the men who were in the army. Now, this has to do with mining and some road repair and other kinds of work. What you see here is a picture from someplace. You notice that these men, a couple of them have these garrison caps on, which were issued because it was actually a military type of battalion arrangement. And they're repairing some kind of, not a railroad, I think. Must be some mine, because these look like these mine carts, which had to be rolled out of the mines on these rails. And it looks to me like this had been damaged probably by bombing or cannon fire, and they're repairing it. The work was physical and very hard, and it was particularly hard because these men that were conscripted were, none of them, I should say none of them, the vast majority of them were not people who were used to physical work. My father was in his early 30s. He was strong as an ox, but he had to get used to working with a shovel, which he had not done very much of in his life. He would receive a phone call, when we still had a phone, or a man would come to the door, or a letter that says on Tuesday at 3 o'clock or whatever, you are to report to this train station. You will be going to a particular location. You'll be gone for a day, a week, a month, or an undetermined period of time. And he was away from home more than he was home. However, all of this was in territorial Hungary. The last place he was in that we know of was a city called Vác, which is about 60 or so kilometers from Budapest, where he was doing whatever kind of work he and the rest of his brigade, or whatever the declaration was of the particular order where they were doing certain work. But he was away from home much more than home, and as a consequence, between the ages of 6 and 8 and 10, when I didn't see him at all, or I saw him sporadically, I was without a father. Now, that has its own consequences.
Manny, you were just 7 years old when German forces occupied Hungary on March 19th, 1944. Anti-Semitic persecution increased dramatically then. Soon, all Jews over the age of 6 were forced to wear the yellow Star of David. Tell us how wearing that star affected your daily life.
Well, first of all, I went to school with a star on, an overcoat, and I thought that was terrific. Here I was, a 6-year-old or 6.5-year-old in first grade, and I went to school, and I had that star on, which was a demarcation, just like all the adults. And I guess 6-year-olds want to be like little adults, and I thought it was terrific. I thought it was a mark of distinction until I found out that it wasn't. And I can mention that now, or we can come back to that later.
No, go on, please. Yeah.
I went to school, and the school was at number 44 of the street where we lived. Our apartment building was number 13. So you can imagine it was very close. As a matter of fact, you could see the school building from my parents' bedroom on the corner of the 5th floor of the apartment at 2 streets. Yet I was told somebody would follow me to school almost every day, my father or somebody. Why? Because there were incidents whereby kids walking to school with the yellow star were whacked on the head. Nobody wanted their books, nobody wanted their backpack or their coat or their shoes. They just wanted to whack them on the head, because this became a target to people who wanted to do mayhem. A little later on one of the times that my father was home from this labor camp, I said to him, Pop, would you be willing to consider to buy me a bike? I had a trike, but I was big enough by this time, maybe 7 or so, or 7.5, to ride like an 18-inch bike. I was, in those days, we were very much older than our years in many ways, so I could ride it. He said, well, I suppose I could buy you a bike. It's not a problem. But there are 2 reasons, minor and major, why I will not. The minor reason was that we lived on the 5th floor, and the bike would have to be schlepped down from the 5th floor to the street to go out to the park to ride the bike, and then schlepped up. We had an elevator, but the elevator was as old as the building itself, which is about 50 years old then. It still stands, and now it's about 120 years old. In any case, the elevator often broke down because the mechanical parts that were needed for its repair were now were to be repaired in shops, which were now involved in military hardware repair. As a consequence, it was very low on the rolls of repair orders, and often it was not working. As a consequence, the bike would have to be taken down. My father said, although that's unpleasant, now remember, I'm 7 years old or so, I could not physically take a bike down 5 floors and up again. My father says, although that's not a particularly pleasant prospect, I will do that. However, when we go out into the park, which was in fact very close to the house, several blocks, you'd go out there and you'd ride the bike. If you're out of my sight with your yellow star for 12 seconds, somebody might decide to whack you on the head. Again, nobody wants the bike, my shoes, my coat, my hat, or whatever, but they want to whack me on the head. I began to understand at that point that this is not a mark of distinction, but a target.
Manny, before we go on, I'd like to remind our audience to please share any questions you have for Manny via our chat feature. In mid-May 1944, the Hungarian authorities began to systematically deport the Jews from the countryside. In less than 2 months, nearly 440,000 Jews were deported, mainly to the Auschwitz-Birkenau killing center. Please tell us what happened to your grandparents and other family members.
Well, as I mentioned, we had visited my mother's parents in 41. They both lived in Novi Sad, as did my two aunts and my cousin. Their husbands had already been taken into these labor camps, and they never made it after the war. They were killed or they died or whatever. But my grandparents and aunts were taken by transport with my cousin to Auschwitz. And we know when they arrived because my aunts could tell us about it. How? Well, in those days, there was a selection process when the trains arrived at Auschwitz. There were two lines. One line was of young kids and older people, my grandparents and my cousin, who was a year younger than I, and they were probably murdered within 24 to 48 hours. The other line was for people who were able-bodied to go to work, where my aunts in their 30s could go. Since they were there together and since my aunts survived, they knew very precisely what were the days when this took place, and they could estimate that my grandparents, their parents, in fact, were murdered within 1 or 2 or 3 days of the time of arrival, and they had a date for that, which I don't recall offhand, probably in August of 1944. My father's mother was living with us in Budapest, but as I said earlier, there were 7 adult children who grew up, and she had probably 2 or 3 others, and there she is. My grandmother had some difficulties with her feet. My father used to have to go to a special store to make shoes for her to be comfortable. And my father and his youngest brother, who also lived in Budapest, was going to school still, decided to ship her back to the village where they all were born in Transylvania. While the village was primitive, there were no bombings. There was no need to go from the 5th floor to the basement 2 or 3 times a night for air raids. Well, that's true. There were no air raids. But what there was is that Eichmann, in fact, cleared the area, and she was taken to Auschwitz as well. And we don't have a definitive date of when that was, but it was sometime in the fall, probably in September. That's the date that we have. You want to remember that Hermann Goering, the number 2 in the Nazi government, issued a letter on behalf of Hitler in 1941, talking about the final solution of the Jewish problem. It was not put into effect until 1942, when there was a conference in Berlin called the Wannsee Conference. There was a building which still stands today. It's a museum called the Wannsee Villa, and that place is where the conference took place, where Adolf Eichmann was appointed as the manager of the transportation of Jews from various places to the various killing centers and the concentration camps. And he cleaned all the cities, Holland, Belgium, France. The last one to be cleaned, as it were, was in fact Hungary, because of its status as an ally to the German government. My grandparents all in Auschwitz.
And I know this particular photograph is precious to you.
This is my grandmother and I, and I'm probably 5 or something, or maybe going 6, standing there with a scooter in front of the front door to our apartment in Budapest as a family picture. I knew her well, and she was shipped back, as I said, to Transylvania and deported from there.
Manny, you, your mother, and your paternal uncle David were among a group of Jews who were part of an extraordinary negotiation. Jewish leaders secured refuge for 1,700 Jews from Hungary in exchange for money and other valuables. Jewish leader Rudolf Kastner negotiated directly with Adolf Eichmann, whom you just told us about, one of the central figures in the final solution, who was responsible for sending many of Europe's Jews to their deaths. Tell us about those negotiations.
Eichmann arrives in Budapest on the 19th of March, 1944, and establishes his headquarters in the Excelsior Hotel. 2 men from kind of a self-generated rescue committee want to approach him to negotiate some kind of a deal for lives. Now, understand, please, that to go see Eichmann in those days was about done with the same ease as if you were to go to Rome today and say, I want to see the Pope now. But these men were able to talk their way in to see Eichmann, and they negotiated an issue. Now, why did they negotiate? You want to understand that by this time, although this is only March or April of 44, most everybody, with the exception of Adolf Hitler himself, knew that Germany would lose the war. This is before Normandy, but the way things were going, that's the way the progress was to be. Nazi leadership, all the way up to Heinrich Himmler, who was number 3 in the German government, were looking for ways to, in some way, either feather or establish their nests after the war. Because after all, they all knew they couldn't go to an employment agency and say, I'm Heinrich Hitler, I want a job. So they were looking to make arrangements, some kind of negotiated deals, and there were a number of these. Ours was not the only one, but I don't know about the others specifically, except this one. They began to negotiate on what they called Blut für Ware, blood for material. And the deal was that Eichmann was to release 1 million Jews from the concentration camp in exchange for 10,000 trucks laden with certain material that he would order, and that would be an arrangement. Well, there was a problem. The problem was that this was absolutely absurd. He, even if he wanted to release 1 million Jews, couldn't, because by this time there were no 1 million Jews in the camps. They had been all mostly murdered. There were some, hundreds of thousands, but not 1 million. As far as the 10,000 trucks, these guys did not have access to a hubcap, let alone 10,000 trucks. As a matter of fact, one of the 2, Joel Brand, was shipped to Egypt. The British had established in Egypt the command post for all logistical and mechanical and transportation systems throughout the European war. And he was going to go to talk to the British about trucks. He was arrested as a spy, was jailed in Cairo, and was there until the war ended. He was released after the war ended and lived for several more years. I don't know his precise situation. Kastner remained in Budapest and negotiations continued. The negotiations for Blut für Ware, blood for wares or for material, went from 1,010,000 to about 1,680 some. I don't know the precise number. There's some question as to the exact number for amount of valuables which were negotiable after the war by the people who had them that were in suitcases, because after all, jewels and that kind of stuff were always of value. You can always buy a meal if you want to trade a watch for a meal, or a piece of diamond, or a ruby, or whatever else. The deal was that we were to be put on trains and be taken to a neutral port to be shipped out of Europe, because Hitler said, I want Jews out of Germany. He got that. We want Jews out of Europe. He almost got that. We want Jews out of the whole world. He did not get that. We were to be put on in a neutral port and more than likely shipped to Palestine, which was a place that would accept us. Eichmann made available 35 boxcars. These are freight cars of the railroad, and 1,700 people or so were put into these cars to be shipped to this neutral port, possibly in Spain or possibly in Turkey. After 9 days on this train,
Manny, just before you tell us about actually being on the train, tell us how you, your mother and your uncle were able to be part of that group.
Sure. The selection process is unknown to anybody. However, what happened is that this relief organization, or this rescue organization, was composed of all manner of Hungarian Jewish leadership. The old, the young, the religious, the non-religious, the Zionists, the non-Zionists. And each was kind of allotted a certain number of people that they could put on the particular train. I have no idea. I was never able to find out. And I have to admit, I did not do extensive research on trying to find out what group had how many seats. However, in one of the groups, we were able to find space because my father had a position of some notoriety in the community. He was known, and so did my uncle, who was involved with some elements of the Hungarian native kind of underground. The underground here was not with guns, But he was involved with some people who would forge papers. The bedroom where I slept in our apartment was vacated once or twice, I remember, and I had to go onto a couch in my parents' bedroom because the printing press that produced fake documents was to be in our house for a day or two. This was a movable feast. It went from place to place, but while this was in our house, we had to be away. And my uncle was involved in this process, so he had a certain kind of knowledge and a certain kind of responsibility and maybe some privilege within these groups. As a consequence, he and I and my mother and a very distant cousin and his future wife actually had space. His future wife was deported to Auschwitz and never joined us, but she did survive the war. So the four of us were in this group, and we were shipped by these 35 boxcars. And after 9 days, we arrived at a place, not a neutral port, but a place that none of us knew called Auschwitz. No, I'm sorry, called Bergen-Belsen. That was the first Auschwitz.
What do you remember? Well, two questions, Manny. One is, your father was not with you. Why was that?
Well, because he was in the labor battalions, and he couldn't just say, "I'm leaving now."
Right.
The consequences were very, very severe. Although it was only 60 kilometers from Budapest, he could have easily transported by train, but he couldn't leave. He was under absolute guard. And as a matter of fact, anybody who tried to leave, the punishment to the group was something called decimation. Decimation was they lined everybody up and every 10th man was shot, period. As simple as that, and as complicated, as tragic as that. He couldn't just walk away. I mean,
right.
He couldn't do that. And survived, obviously, but not with us.
So without your father, you go, it's a 9-day journey in these boxcars, and you end up in a place called Bergen-Belsen. What do you remember about your arrival at Bergen-Belsen?
Well, again, in some odd ways, the almost 8-year-old that's doing this traveling finds some of this as kind of either exciting or maybe in some way dramatic or in some way kind of adventurous. But we arrived in Bergen-Belsen. We got out of the train on a platform and were told to march in a certain direction. When we arrived at these barracks, each holding about 100 to 120 people, it was not enormously crowded, but it was not, it's not leisurely either. We were divided into various groups of men, women in different barracks, and then there was a barrack that had to do with families, which usually meant mothers and children. I and my mother were in fact in that barrack. The barracks were sparse. The barracks had 3-tiered bunk beds. My mother and I had the 3 tiers, and that's where we stayed. That was home, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Manny, we have a video question from a student, Kaya, from Maryland. Let's hear from Kaya.
Hi, my name is Kaya. I'm from College Park, Maryland. During your family's time in Bergen-Belsen, what was the community like, and how did you and your mother spend your days?
Kaya's question, she asks, during your family's time in Bergen-Belsen, what was the community like, and how did you and your mother spend your days?
Well, my mother and I and everybody else essentially spent our days in similar non-activities. There were 2 things that we were concerned about every day. The first, we go back to something with which you talked about earlier, called the census. In German, it's called the Appell, the counting of people. Not the leadership, but the Nazis decided that we have to be counted every day. We're told at dawn, we're to be outside of the barracks, lined up in a formation to be counted. Now, the problem was that they would come not at dawn. They would come at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, or not 12 o'clock. I think the latest ever was 11. But for several hours every day, after it began to start raining, it was August, September, the weather was not good. We would be out there in the mud and the mire, waiting to be counted. They would count us, and then we'd go back into the cabins. That was a major stressful situation for us for some time, until one of the officers said, "This is absurd." I mean, some logic did exist. He said, "I'm going to be here at 8 o'clock in the morning. I don't care if you get here 5 minutes of 8, but be here at 8 o'clock. Well, we weren't at 5 of 8, but we were there maybe at 7:30. But 25, 30 minutes of waiting for him to arrive were an awful lot better than hours on end. The second activity had to do with food, or what you called food. Our food deliveries were twice a day. In the morning, as it happened, our particular set of barracks were across the main road from one of the many kitchens in Bergen-Belsen. At one time, Bergen-Belsen had 25,000 people. So you can imagine there were various kinds of field kitchens. Some men from our group on the guard would literally cross the road, not very far, and come back with vats, kind of like garbage cans, and they were clean, of some liquid in the morning, some dark liquid, and bread. The bread was very good. Occasionally, some butter came with it. The dark liquid was coffee, or that's what they called it. I don't know what it was. But the major good part of it was the fact that it was warm. Now, we were told to bring some food with us for the train ride, and people brought food, and people brought thermoses, and of course, that was all used up. Well, much of it was used up, but the thermoses could be refilled with this warm liquid, which gave us some warmth during the day, to warm up a bed, or to warm your hands, or to warm your insides by drinking it. Was it good? Probably not, but it was warm. In the afternoon, 4 or 5 o'clock, I don't know exactly when, the same thing took place. Now what came back again was some bread, no butter, and some brown thing with some stuff floating in it, maybe a carrot, maybe a potato, maybe a piece of meat, maybe it was horse meat, I don't know. But again, the people who then dealt with the food, the women, the mothers, did miraculous things with these things that they would recreate in various fashions. And obviously, we didn't starve to death. Now, we didn't have a lot of food. We were hungry all the time, but we were not the skeletons that you see in Bergen-Belsen 3 or 4 months after we left, when the camp was being liberated in April of 1945.
Manny, we have an audience question from Kayla. Kayla asks, did you have any health problems from being there?
Well, whether being there was the cause of that, I don't know, but I developed some form of pneumonia, which is, is a bacterial infection of your lungs. Now, we had 35 doctors in the group of the camp, and these doctors were medically trained without any equipment, or they may have had handbags, but no medication. You know that pneumonia as an infection is treated with antibiotics, which were not yet available. Penicillin had just been recently discovered. I can assure you, the first place that he went to was not the concentration camps. Right. And the doctors told my mother, look, if the kid is strong enough physically, he will survive because his body will recover. And if he's not, that's the end. They could do nothing except give me some, what today is called palliative care. What's palliative care? It makes you feel a little bit less sore or less hurt. They found someplace, again, I don't know how these things came about, but they found burlap material. They found mustard seed, which they crushed. They took some of the hot water from the morning coffee. They put the mustard seed powder in it and then soaked the burlap bag to pick up the mustard seed, which they then draped across my chest. Now, the function of that was to act like a mentholatum kind of thing, like Vicks or Bengay. It gave a menthol kind of an effect, and it warmed my chest. Now, when you breathe in with pneumonia, it hurts. You put something warm on the chest, it makes you feel a little better. Did it cure anything? No. Did it make you feel better? Yes.
Manny, this is what you're describing was what you experienced along with the others that were part of the Kastner train. How did your experience differ from other prisoners at Bergen-Belsen?
The major significant difference for our 1,700 or some people was that remember, Bergen-Belsen was not a death camp. Lots and lots of people died of malnutrition, of starvation, and of typhus, which is a major disease, which I didn't have. But the point was that they died, among other reasons, because they were turned out to work every day in farming, in agriculture, in mining, and whatever. They would march out in the morning and march back at night. Our group was not turned out to work. Why? Because the arrangement for the Nazis to get the loot was to get the loot after we were released, whenever that was. Mm-hmm. And it was a per capita kind of an arrangement whereby if some of us had died, the loot would be reduced. There was X amount of whatever valuables I don't know, a couple $1,000 a person. And if 10 people died, it's $20,000 less. And I'm making up those numbers. They're close, but I don't know precisely.
Right.
So
right.
they were very concerned that although we did have major food and other things, and when we went out to showers periodically, we didn't know until after many years, sometime later, that some showers in some places didn't have water but gas. We had water. We didn't know that either. But they were concerned that we stay alive on some condition, and nobody died, including me.
Out of the entire group. That's amazing. Yep. Manny, we have another audience question from Cassie. Cassie asks, did you manage to keep your faith while you were in the camp and after?
One of the fascinating things to me, and fascinating, more recently, is the fact that the thing that happened at camp was an attempt to return to normalcy. Now, how are you going to be normal in Bergen-Belsen is difficult to describe. But what happened is the school was open, lectures were open, concerts were open, the synagogue was built, all kinds of normal relationships were established in order to experience that which could have been normal even under these circumstances. As a consequence, our being Jews and being whatever we were before continued. And there was no challenge to that by the Nazis or anybody else.
Manny, in December 1944, after 6 months in Bergen-Belsen, you and the majority of the group you arrived with were sent to Switzerland. Tell us about what happened after you arrived in Switzerland.
Well, negotiations continued, and after 6 weeks in Bergen-Belsen, about 350 of the people, I have no idea by what choice, were in fact taken out of Bergen-Belsen, put on German troop trains, which were not first-class trains, but they were not boxcars, and shipped to Switzerland, which was willing to accept them. Some months later, the full 6 months that I spent, I was not in the first group. We all were taken out of Bergen-Belsen and taken to Switzerland. Now, the Swiss are very clever people. The gauge of the railroad in Switzerland is different than the gauge in Germany. You can't drive a German train into Switzerland, which also means you can't invade Switzerland by railroad. Clever. We arrived near the city of St. Gallen in the German part of Switzerland. We came out of our troop trains also, not boxcars, which were dark and without electricity, without lights. So we could cross the platform into these lit, beautiful, warm, inviting Swiss trains, which then took us into the city. We were offered hot chocolate, other kind of chocolate, lots of nice things. The first thing the Swiss did to us when we arrived is decided that after coming out of Bergen-Belsen, but with good reason, we should be fumigated so we don't bring the vermin into Switzerland, which is a very clean country. We were there. From there, we were taken to the French part of Switzerland, which is near Montreux, into a beautiful resort hotel, which was at that time run by the Red Cross. And we were fed, well, a lot of potatoes. Somebody once asked, what was our first meal? I said, I don't remember the first meal, but I do remember with a certain amount of authority that potatoes should be part of it. They thought that with potatoes and things of that nature, we would gain a few pounds. Now, we were not skeletons, but we could use a few pounds. We were there for several weeks, at which point the group had to be divided up. Some people went back to Hungary, not to Hungary, but to other environs in Switzerland. Some were shipped elsewhere, and I and 19 other kids, ages 6 to 14, were shipped to a boarding school in the German part of Switzerland, in Herisau province, in the city of Heiden, to be there for whatever length of time. We didn't know, but we were there until September of that year. And rather interestingly, one of the people who was shipped with us was my mother. Why? They knew that she had been a teacher. Now, the 20 of us needed some kind of, quote, education. Now, how you run a classroom for kids from ages 6 to 14 is difficult, but she came along as a guardian, as a caretaker, as a referee, because among other things, and the most important part was this, my mother had very good German for school. She had a considerable amount of French as well, and none of us had anything except Hungarian. Now, what you see here is, I think, that 20 or whatever number of us, the group, You see on the very right, the woman with a hat is the nurse. She didn't speak a word of Hungarian. Somebody had to translate for her. My mother's in the middle with the circle around her head. The man on the left with the bald head is Mr. Müller, who was the director of the camp, who was a Viennese German or Viennese Jew. As a consequence, somebody had to be there to try and translate the most elementary of discussion with the people who were there. I mean, if we needed toilet paper, we didn't know how to say that in German or French. You can see my mother has a circle around her head, and I have a circle around my head on the bottom on the left. Mr. Müller, I mean, after Switzerland came actually to Philadelphia, where I spent most of my young high school days, and became the director of an orphan's home, and I had a chance to meet with him again. And of course, by today, he's long gone.
We had another picture from this time. We passed over it. Let's go back to it. Tell us, this is your mom and you, right?
Yes, and the distant cousin who was with us, who at the time was, by this time in 45, he was 4 or 5 years old. He is a young man who then eventually did get to Palestine with all of us and stayed there. And he has a family with several children. He is now 82 years old. I visited with him 4 or 5 years ago, and we're in touch on a non-regular basis. But he was my brother for 2 years.
Briefly describe, what was life like at the children's home for you? What was that experience like for you?
Well, it was a boarding school experience. We ate meals together. We, did our cleanup together. We went to school together. I can't describe precisely how it was divided because obviously the 14-year-olds were not learning how to read and write with a 6-year-old, and he was the youngest of the bunch, or the 7 or 8-year-old. Most of us were probably between 9 and 12. I was 8. Well, we were in Switzerland in the school. It was a lovely place. There were we could go skiing, we could go hiking, we could go into the forest. Life was very nice. As a boarding school life would be in any situation. The fact that we were Holocaust survivors was not important. We had some contact with the other kids, and as we learned some German and a little bit of French, we could communicate with them. The other kids are from Belgium and Holland and German and Jewish kids. But as I say, the first problem was we couldn't talk with them. So we kind of talked our own language, which was with our hands and our feet. But life was very nice from December or so until September of the next year, or August of the next year, the 45. Now, I was there as the war ended, which ended on 8th of May, 1945.
And that happened to be your birthday, right?
Well, there were 3 important things that happened on May the 8th, 1945. We heard about this, of course, on the radio. Switzerland is close to Germany, and we were very pleased with that, but I don't remember anything changing. The 3 things that are important on the 8th of May is that the fact the war ended on the 8th of May, 1945. I was born on the 8th of May in 1936. The President of the United States, who at that time was no longer Roosevelt, he died in April, it was Harry Truman. Harry Truman was born on the 8th of May, 18 something or other. I don't recall the year, but the date I recall. So every May 8th of every year, I recall my birthday, the end of the war, and the birthday of one of my favorite historic figures, namely Harry S. Truman.
Manny, tell us what happened to your family once the war ended.
Well, we discovered what parts of the family were around. I mentioned earlier 2 aunts of my mother's sisters, who in fact survived the war and were back in Yugoslavia, eventually moved to then Palestine and then to Israel. Her youngest brother was drafted into the Yugoslav army very shortly after and was sent to Italy. He was taken POW in Italy and survived the war as a POW, also returned to Yugoslavia. Her 2 older brothers both died in labor camp or some other fashion. Her parents died in the same way. My father's 2 younger brothers died in labor camps. The youngest brother made it to Israel with us and was there, unfortunately, at the age of 35, having received a very prestigious teaching position in the city of Haifa, died of a stroke or a heart attack or both very suddenly in 1949. Other than that, their children, if, as I said to you, the children who would have been with us or would have been alive, cousins, also were killed at various kinds of death camps.
Manny, I'd like to share a question and a comment from the audience. The comment is, thank you for sharing your story and living to tell your history, both the good and the awful, and asks, what was the reunion with your father like?
Well, as we talked about earlier, from 42 to 44, I saw him sporadically and irregularly. From 44 to 46, I didn't see him at all. We got to Palestine then in 1945 in September. He was unable to get there until August of 1946. That's a whole other story. But the point is, when we met, we had now been in a different country. We had a different language. I was speaking Hebrew. He knew some Hebrew, knew a lot of Hebrew, but it was no longer the language with which we parted in 1942. We had to get reacquainted. I had missed 4 years with him, kind of. Mm-hmm. And there were things that I didn't understand and he didn't understand, because he had not been a father for 4 years, and those are 4 formative years for his son. Let me also add that it was the one son that he had because, because I am quite sure, although we never discussed this, that my parents, as did the rest of the family, made a decision in the 30s. I was born in 36. I had a cousin born in 35, another one in 36, another one in 37. They would have produced a sibling for these children in 38, 39, 40, 41. By that time, they came to the very clear decision and point that this is not the time to bring children into the world. As a consequence, my aunt, who had a daughter who was killed at Auschwitz, only had that daughter. The other one had no children. The uncle who was in the POW had no children, didn't marry after the war. Another uncle's son survived, and the oldest uncle's 2 children also survived. But the point is, the rest of us grew up as only children, to the point that of the 6 adults in my mother's family, including her, only 5 children were produced. 6 adults.
Well, that's remarkable. Thank you for sharing that. I have just one more question for you today, Manny. As we face rising anti-Semitism, related conspiracy theories, and Holocaust denial, please tell us what we can learn from you about what you experienced during the Holocaust.
It's not so much what you can learn from me, but what you can learn from what I experienced. I'm a fan of a philosopher that came up with a phrase which all of us remember, although we don't remember his name. He said, those of us who do not learn our history well may be doomed to repeat it, parts of it, or elements of it. His name was George Santayana. He said this in California as a professor 120 years ago or thereabouts. The point I want to make is that if we don't learn what happened, whether it's my experience or the experience of thousands and millions of others, we are making a mistake, because we cannot know what's in the future unless we have a very clear understanding of what took place in the past. Today, we talked about my past, which has been helpful in my present, and I hope it'll be helpful in my future, which I hope is around for a few more years. Thank you.
Thank you, Manny, so much. Before we close, I'd like to share one more comment from the audience. Michelle writes, so proud of you, goosebumps, and I haven't heard Uncle Lewis's voice in years. He and my grandmother look so much alike.
Michelle is my first cousin once removed. My grandmother was my father's sister. My grandmother had a daughter who came to this country in 1914, who had 3 children. The youngest of those children, my first cousin, is the mother of Michelle, who lives in Philadelphia.
So glad
Thanks,
she was
Michelle.
able. Oh, that's wonderful. Manny, thank you so much for being our first person. You have shared with us, I would imagine, a part of the Holocaust that very few of us are acquainted with. The story of the Kastner train, how remarkable, beginning with a preposterous proposal to trade 1 million lives for 10,000 trucks, and it ends up with 1,700, and you and your mom were part of that. Thank you very much, Manny.
Pleasure, Bill. See you again.
I'd like to also take a moment to thank our donors. First Person is made possible through the generous support of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I'd also like to invite you to join our next program. Please tune in on January 18th, 2023 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Holocaust survivor and museum volunteer Agi Giva. Despite unimaginable challenges, Agi, her sister, and her mother managed to stay together during the Holocaust, surviving a death march in 4 different camps, including Auschwitz. Join us to hear Agi's story of survival. Thank you for watching.